On this episode of the Camp Owners Podcast, Howie and I sit down with the Kimmelmans from Camp Tumbleweed in California in LA. And Andy and Liz are flipping the focus on retention and staff retention to staff resentment. And how does that happen? And what does that look like, especially with our returning staff? So we have a fantastic conversation about matching up expectations with the reality for the job and matching the counselor and the staff to your values of your camp. And right from the get-go, from the first moment they step on your camp, reaffirming that match. So we hope that you will enjoy this episode as much as we did. They are fantastic camp people, so progressive and forward thinking, and we really enjoyed it. So we hope you enjoy it as well. Welcome to the Camp Owners Podcast, a space for camp owners to talk about the unique aspects of camp ownership and get inspired by each other. We're going to sit down with camp industry experts, leaders, and fellow camp owners to hear how the camp dream transpired for them, learn from each other, and discuss some of the biggest issues in the private camp industry. Welcome, everyone. I'm Kelly Shuna, owner and executive director of Hidden Pines Ranch Day Camp, located in Stillwater, Minnesota.
Hi, everyone. Howie Grossinger here. Glad to have you back. I am the co-owner and director of Camp Robin Hood, a day camp in Toronto, and co-owner of Camp Walden, an overnight camp in Northern Ontario. If you are looking to find and subscribe to the Camp Owners Podcast, you can either find us online at gocamp.pro/ownerspod or by searching for us in your favorite podcast app. Finally, if you're listening to this and think it would be useful for other camp owners or aspiring camp owners in your circle, please feel free to send them a note to listen. Hi, Kelly.
Hello, Howie. How are you?
I'm doing great.
Great. Well, you ready to get down to business? But, first we have to thank one of our two sponsors. How lucky are we to have two sponsors? And I'm going to thank our first one to get us started. We want to give a big shout out to the sponsor of this podcast, one of them, Camp Brain. They have been doing this since 1994 with 45 plus dedicated staff to meet your every need. Camp Brain provides a comprehensive and flexible registration system that can handle all of your day, overnight, family, holiday, and one-off camping events. I also hear that they have a new fantastic camp store feature. So if you are thinking about swag and what that's going to look like, and you want an upgrade, talk to Camp Brain. You can check them out at campbrain.com or call 866-485-8885. Howie, I'm so excited for today's topic. It was one where I read it and thought, oh, scandalous. We're not going to talk about retention. We're going to talk about resentment. I love topics like that get me thinking like, oh, okay. And I love that it came from the Kimmelmans, who co-own and direct Camp Tumbleweed in LA. The camp has been around since 1954, and Liz and Andy have owned it for 9 years. And I have gotten to know them through Wake and other things. And I really love how progressive they are, they talk a lot about progressive issues, and they're very forward thinking. So I'm not shocked that this topic came from them, but I'm really excited to have them on the podcast for the first time, Howie.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a great conversation. It's always nice when people challenge thinking and just different ways to do that. So no, I'm pretty pumped for this as well.
So welcome, Andy and Liz. Thank you for being on our show today.
Thanks for having us.
So before we get into your somewhat scandalous topic here, I would like for the two of you to share, as Howie describes it, I love it, your Marvel story. So talk to us about your introduction into camping and how you went from your camp dream or that inspiration to where the two of you are today.
You want me to go first, Liz? Because my history is a little bit longer. So I grew up going to summer camp. I grew up in Texas and had a long career at sleepaway camp there as a camper. I fell in love with it as a counselor and decided instead of getting into the business world that I had intended to, I was going to be a camp director. And I subsequently started working here at Tumbleweed just after I graduated college, and thought maybe I would do it for a few years. And put it on my resume for the next big thing, and I never left. And eventually, the family who had owned camp since the 90s was getting out of the business, and Liz and I had the great good fortune to be able to take over the ownership from them in 2014. So that's how we got to the place that we are. And, we're the very traditional summer camp story. Liz and I met my first summer working at Tumbleweed. It was one of her second or third year working here. So we met and that was it. It was like a rom-com.
It's like Sleepless in Seattle, but the camp version or something.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, and someday we might have to further dive into the Texas versus Rhode Island. I mean, those are very different cultures here.
Sure.
So this is a rom-com with, a coastal, addition here. So
That's
Liz,
right.
you want to go?
Sure. Yeah. So I grew up New England or in the Northeast, because I also lived in upstate New York for a while. I've actually moved around a lot. So have lived on the East Coast and then moved to California for high school and then back to the East for college. So I've been kind of all over the place. And I actually never went to camp as a kid. It wasn't what my family did. And so in high school, when I was out here, I had kind of a rough junior year, and friends of ours said, well, you should probably do something with your summer. Why don't you just apply to work at this camp called Tumbleweed? And I remember going, I think I interviewed the first week of June. So I was a very late interview and interviewed and worked that first year and was sold. I was super into it. So even though I never went to camp as a kid, I got to join as a counselor, and that experience has been wonderful. And I went to college for politics. I didn't go to college for education, but have only ever worked in education and youth development. I've had the great joy of having experiences for more traditional education. I've been a behavior therapist and have also worked at overnight camps as well. And then, like Andy said, back in 2013, we were given the chance to purchase Tumbleweed, and we couldn't turn it down. And it's been quite the roller coaster since, in such a great way.
That's awesome. And I think the story, and we talk about this throughout all of our shows, the origin story is so valuable because, Liz, you have a really great talking point, especially on this topic. We're going to talk about staff, right? Some staff come to day camp or overnight camp thinking like, oh, not having previous camp experience is like a disqualifier kind of thing. Some people think of those things, but, your story and others, and especially in a world where staff recruitment or being able to staff our camps, particularly this coming summer, is such high priority, and we're recognizing the challenges. It's nice to be able to, I would think, be able to share that story when people think, well, I never did this before, so I'm probably not a great candidate, but there's value in your story because look what it's done for you now. So I really appreciate that angle of your origin story as well. It's pretty awesome. For Kelly and myself, the topic of staff recruitment is forever on our minds. And while the four of us are predominantly day camp centric, I do believe, the topic that we're going to address is relevant across the board and could definitely be considered by all of our camp owner listeners out there. But when you think about this shift in mindset that I think you're suggesting for camp owners, from less of like, we focus on staff recruitment, but hey, we got to start thinking about staff resentment. And I'm curious about, and Kelly and I are curious about your why for this topic. Like how did it dawn on you? How did this come away? How did you package it this way for what's on your mind right now? I think that's a great starting point for us in this conversation.
Yeah, sure. So a lot of what comes from this is both what we're going to get into talking about staff resentment and the work culture or the work environment that you have at your camp and how that affects both your recruiting efforts, your retention efforts, your ability to hang on to staff during the summer. But another portion of this, which is kind of in the front part of it, is not paying so much attention to those staff retention numbers, in the sense that we also want to balance it with talking about how to build a positive staff retention culture. I think both of those things go hand in hand. We're going to talk a little bit about where folks really slip up and I think start to build a culture in which they have a negative staff retention culture, which leads a lot to this breeding of resentment within your staff. Really what we're looking at is many camps are struggling with hiring, with recruiting, with getting the numbers they need for the summer. And when you see former staff that want to come back and you can fill those spots with staff that you already know and that are already going to work for you, it's really enticing. It's really making you feel like, okay, well, if I need 19 staff and 10 of these staff are coming back, I just need the numbers. And what ends up happening is that you start to build up a system of negative staff retention because you're just getting people in the door. You're not hiring for culture fit. You're not considering the care and needs of the staff during the summer. And you're also probably not paying as much attention to your employer brand as you should be. And so then you're starting to really snowball into a world where, and I think we've all felt this way too, in the middle of the summer, you're around some of these staff and you're just like, oh, why did I have them come back? And you should never feel that way, right? You should never be around staff or not want to go to a particular program area because you don't want to have tension with a staff member. And so really our goal is to really work with camp owners and help them see how they can view these problems and find the root causes through various different lenses so that they can be more proactive with their staff hiring and eventually positive staff retention culture.
I've just gone through an exercise in my head of where I've done those things in the last 5 years. So it's
feeling.
Oh my gosh, it sounds like, and I'm Andy. I'm so interested in hearing your thoughts as well. But this idea that sometimes we get so bogged down, I can identify with. We're settling because the numbers are being satisfied, and I know that I've been guilty of that over the years, and that like, oh, I just need that one junior boy counselor, or those guys are for sure what I need. And then after they say yes, you're like, okay, I just really hope it works out, So I can identify with that. Andy, some of your thoughts?
I think, to be clear, Liz and I are really big fans of retaining awesome staff. I know there's camps out there who are like, I don't want to have more than 50% returners because it negatively impacts the culture. We have almost 75% of our staff every year are returners. And if I had 100 awesome counselors, I want every single one of them to come back. But I think too often when we're talking to camps, not all of your counselors are amazing. And if you continue holding on to too many of those, it starts to, like Liz said, snowball to where it's impacting other people's experience. And then it's negatively impacting the way that you hire, the way that you do your training, the way that you take care of your staff during the summer. So I think a lot of this came out of just listening to other camp directors, reading some of the talk on the Camp Pros Facebook group about people's issues. There was this article in the New York Times in the summer about really negative experiences that folks had working at summer camp. And there's a lot of different issues. If you ask a camp director, what's your staffing problem? There's a lot of different answers to that. But I think underlying each of those things, whether it's you can't get enough applicants or they're ghosting you before orientation starts, or they leave in the middle of the summer, there's just a few kind of root causes underlying those problems. And we want to get folks to look at those root causes and not just the numbers game of, I need enough applicants and they have to show up and they have to stay through the whole summer.
I wonder too, at least for me, what I saw last summer was the impact of change and COVID and how that felt for returning staff. They had some that just hopped on board and were like, okay, and those are probably the ones where you're like, yes, I want them back. And then the ones where it was really hard for them were probably the ones where, oh, was that a good choice to have you come back versus new? We're like, I don't know any different. So I think that is really interesting to think about, that positive, negative. And yeah, I mean, you have 100 staff, but you're right. It's really not possible to have all or want all 100 to come back.
That's a really interesting connection you make, Kelly. And I think back to, we were open in the summer of 2020, like not very many camps, but some of us. And we were fortunate to have a good pool of returning staff that summer who wanted to come back. And we had really honest conversations with them about, if you're going to work at camp this summer, here's what it means. Here's what that's going to look like. And here's the potential risk you're taking on by doing that. These are the things we're asking you to do that are different than what we've asked you before. Are you okay with that? If not, that's okay. We'll see you again in 2021, hopefully, or in the future. And I think maybe it's worth having that kind of conversation with your returning staff every summer, because there's always some change that's happening. It's not just the COVID stuff, but there's a change in your program, or there's a change in that counselor's life trajectory. They're a different person in 2022 than they were in 21. And it's worth talking about those things and being honest on both ends about what's different.
I also think that there are some camps, I know some in our neighborhood up here, that haven't run for 2 summers. And the idea that it's now been 2 summers and retention is taking a real hit because it's been 2 years and there's been other influences, and will it ever be the same again kind of stuff. And I think that, it's a challenge. It has been a challenge throughout the pandemic in many different forms, whether you didn't run in 2020, came back in 2021. And I think we've been trying to find ways as well to market what the comeback has looked like. Many camps are talking about getting staff to talk about how rewarding it was to come back. Amongst the change was actually kind of rewarding to be part of those kinds of things. And we're trying to find, and I know many camps are trying to find different ways to market that as a benefit for also coming to camp too, be part of something, super special. And I think we all, depending on sort of the tact we take to recruit, are looking at those things. I also think, just generally, as I'm hearing both of you speak, there is something to be said for new applicants to know that they're not necessarily coming into an environment where they're amongst less than 10% new people or something like that. And I thought maybe you could comment on some of like those things that like there's something to be said. And so how many people do you have back? Well, we have 90%. Oh, so I'm going to be one of 4 people, depending on the size of the camp, that are coming back. Can you speak to that? Like some of, that, because I think that's a factor in some of these considerations too.
Yeah, I think a lot of this is boiling down to a couple of major things. One is going to be your employer brand, and how are you signaling to possible employees that you're going to be the best fit for them. I think so often as employers, we think like we are in charge, we are picking the candidate, it's about our choice. And really, it's got to be a two-way street. You want to make sure that you're picking someone that's going to match with your values, and they want to make sure that they're picking a place to work for that's going to match with their expectations. And so a couple of things have to go into play there. One, I think when you're talking about that sense of coming in the first day or coming in at orientation and realizing you are one of 4 new staff, a lot of what that feeling is going to be like is determined by how you have built up the values that your camp is living through. And that has to be a huge part of your culture during orientation. That's something that you, as an owner or a director, you have total control over that. You could still have 90% of your staff come back, but because of the way that you're leading them and you are developing your first impressions with those new staff, it shouldn't make a difference. Like you were saying before, every summer is going to be a different summer. Even for some of those returning staff, it's going to be a different summer. And so to make sure that you're creating a culture in which when they come there, that is the life they're living for 2022 or whatever it is, that's going to be really key. So that it doesn't matter how many returning staff you have, and it doesn't matter how many new staff you have. You're doing things the way you're going to do it that summer at your place. So I think that's one really critical piece. I think another really critical piece is to be really clear and upfront with your applicants. So you're matching early on what they're expecting their work life is going to be like and what it's actually going to be like. You know, I think Andy touched on this a little bit, and this is a big part of what we think of when we think of resentment. So much stress and anxiety and resentment comes from a lack of or a mismatch in what the staff are expecting and what they are experiencing. And again, you as the director, you as the owner have total control over that. You need to make sure that you are not creating a system in which there is a certain expectation for one thing and they're living a different thing, because that is where so much of their bandwidth is going to go. Even something simple as, you know, during orientation, you're walking around with them and you're in the dining hall and you point out where the coffee is in the morning, and maybe during orientation, coffee is made every morning. But when life gets underway for the rest of the summer, if the staff are having to make the coffee and it's not being made, and there's these tiny little mix-ups with that, that's creating more and more and more anxiety and resentment, because it's disrupting their expectation of something that they thought was going to happen. Something as small as that you can change. You can deal with that.
I remember my first summer as a camp counselor. I was 18 years old, and I was so stoked to start I think we had like a week and a half of orientation. I've been a camper for 8 years, and I was like, yeah, I'm a counselor now. This is happening. And like the first 3 days of orientation, I was trimming all the trees and sweeping the black widows out of the ball field storage closet. And I think we've all like kind of been there and done that. And I think some folks think that that's okay because it's what they did their first summer as a counselor too. But when you're selling staff on the incredible impact they're going to have on their campers and the awesome skills they're going to gain by working at camp and all of the great benefits they're going to obtain from being a counselor with you, when their first experience is doing menial labor and not creating that community and connection, it's not a good way to start things off. And yeah, I mean, that's all there is to it.
Yeah. And the kids haven't even shown up yet.
Exactly.
Right.
I think so. So many of us can know that sensation of a bad first impression when you go to a party or you start working at camp for the first time, and all of a sudden you have a thought of, did I make a mistake? Is this like, am I actually not supposed to be here? And already then you have 10 weeks in front of you. And as an employer, you are now like behind the ball in terms of getting your staff to show up as their authentic selves on day one, because they have to do so much work managing their anxiety and concern about these little things that you could have solved before they showed up.
Yeah, it's so funny, Liz. My mind is going to this thing we have developed that I'm most proud of at day camp for new staff orientation, and in our setting we might have 120 brand new staff. We have we're lucky. We operate with a big team, and I know my associate director who's been at camp for 25 years. The pep talk annually is I turn things over to Jeff, and he looks at my senior team who's now going to be putting on the first touch point of physically being on the site. And his message to them is, our goal tonight is to have them leaving that they made the best decision for their summer. Right. And I know that Howie and Sari can do their own thing, but that message on that first night, I just turned things over to Jeff. And he's been a football coach for 25 years, so he gets his best, pep talk, self ready. But it really is about just as early as possible. And I'm assuming you have some tips on how we can sort of build that in early. But it's like you got to have your people early on feeling that they made the best decision possible, so they're not doubting what they've done. And I think some of the examples point to, we can sometimes unintentionally or not even being aware put something in their head that put some doubt into their mind. That's what I'm hearing, at least.
I think you're totally right, Howie. I think for us, it starts with that first impression. And the best tip I think I can give about that is we do a full week, 5 days of orientation with all of our staff. And I know some resident camps are doing more than that. Some day camps are doing less than that. But we spend our whole entire first day, that whole Monday, is strictly about building community and bringing our new team into the same culture as the returning staff. We're not doing any paperwork. We're not doing any, here's how you teach archery. It's 100% community building. And I think that if you look at that, maybe however long your orientation is, that the first 20% of it is creating that incredible first impression. And I love how you said that, like, you want people leaving knowing that they made a good decision for what they're doing in the summer. And I think you can accomplish that.
So how do you do that, Andy? Like, how do you, on that first day, what does that specifically look like? Is it games? Is it, connecting them with each other, asking questions? Like, what does that actual community building on that first day look like at Tumbleweed?
What I would start off by saying is that both with the whole schedule of orientation and with, we could even go back to the hiring, but everything we do is so values based. It gets a little meta sometimes. So even that first day, in a week that is built on the values and the expectations of the culture that we're going to build, that first day is then broken up into what are the values and the beliefs that we want to experience together. And really we're creating moments in which the staff can experience smaller parts of those values that we live towards. So we have a series of different things, and whether it has to do with staff or whether it has to do with the camp as a whole, but a lot of them have to do with being your best self, being kind, being responsible, being respectful. And so throughout the day then, and community is really, really important to us as well. And so throughout the day, we're doing games, we're doing activities, we're building up to moments of joy together. We're doing things that are critical in coming together as a group. During the off season, we do a lot of reading. We listen a lot to Brene Brown. So we take a lot from her and a lot of what she talks about in terms of being able to have a place of true belonging. You need to be able to have these core components. And a lot of that is moments of joy, being able to have challenging conversations without having arguments, being able to have physical moments of problem solving. So we build that up throughout the day so that they are physically experiencing the values and the feeling of what it's going to be like at camp. And so it's a mixture of games, but it's a lot of, the very first thing we also do is we want to make sure that we're not getting really, really excited and everybody's there and everybody's welcomed and then we're sitting down. So like we kind of gradually enter into more and more active participation, so that it's not, again, we're meeting expectations, we're building expectations, we're building an environment that is building optimism. So all of these little components that by the end of the day, very much Howie, like you were saying, they're going to walk away and they're going to think like, this is my place.
Was there a moment where, when you sort of transitioned and morphed into this approach of being intentional in this way, did you get a sense of this because you got anecdotal feedback on this? Was there a moment, I think for us as camp owners and directors, I'm curious about, like, you may be creating some of this resentment and you're not getting the feedback. Like, do you go after it? Do you find out? Have you done surveys? Do you do, focus groups? Like, I'm curious about aside from all the good reading you do and your good instincts, was there a moment that was like the light bulb and said, hey, we got to fundamentally change this because we got some people who are not feeling so good right now? Like, I'm curious about sort of the origin of that.
Yeah, what was the origin of that? That's a good question. A couple of things that come to mind. I think there was a period of time when I was a younger camp director that I talked to my boss, who was the executive director here at the time, a lot about like counselors complaining about stuff. And the stuff that counselors complain about. And we would have these conversations complaining about their complaining and talking about like, man, these people are like adults or almost that, and they chose this job voluntarily and they just need to suck it up. And I realized, sort of looking at the consequences of that really wasn't right. And I absolutely love, Liz mentioned Brene Brown, so I don't know, we'll have to limit the Brene Brown quotes that we throw out here. But one of my— No,
you don't. We do. Kelly does it every show.
Okay, good. One of my favorites is you have to either spend a reasonable amount of time attending to people's fears and feelings or an unreasonable amount of time managing undesired behavior, something like that. And I think that that's so true, and particularly in the camp context where you have people for a short and intense amount of time, you see how quickly that little complaint that they had about, the lunch being late or the special event not being set up, like how quickly that resentment builds up over the course of the next 3 days. And then all of a sudden you're dealing with a counselor who's unmotivated, who's creating a little bit of a toxic culture where they're impacting negatively other staff members' feelings. And I'll speak for myself, when I started trying to approach those complaints or concerns from a point of curiosity and problem solving with the counselors, like, yeah, sometimes lunch is late or the bus is late or a parent gets mad at you and that was sad, and like, that's okay, we're going to work through it, we're going to talk through it. And it feels hard to do that sometimes because they're hard conversations to have sometimes, but it's so much easier than dealing with the undesired behavior on the back end of it.
Yeah. Brene Brown and Ted Lasso. We got it all covered here, Kelly and I. So we're all good. Don't worry. We got 2021 was all that.
Yeah.
No, I really like that approach because I think it's that proactive versus reactive, and it's getting it at the root cause in the beginning, because you're right, it does snowball and then becomes toxic, and you're dealing with a whole, and it's leaching, versus remaining in one person and dealing with it. So how do you do that? Are you, it sounds like in staff training, I'm assuming you have conversations about difficult conversations and probably using Brene Brown strategies or someone else. So are you setting that up in the interview, teaching them in staff training? And then during your camp day, are you really intentional about checking in with them? Are you asking questions like, how are things going? Really, how are things going? Talk to me. Or like, how are you getting to those fears and feelings before it becomes undesired behavior?
There's kind of two avenues here. We spend a significant amount of time, I would say, during the middle of the summer, well, after orientation, during the middle of the summer and after the summer as an executive team, debriefing that portion. And we really get into those little tiny things that came up too. So we'll spend hours just talking about arrival and departure, and where were the slip ups, and where were the complaints, and where were the staff making, sad faces, for lack of a better term, and getting into like, why is that happening? One very specific example that I can think of that I think speaks to this, like, how are we actually making the changes and how are we actually implementing them? for a long time, we would accept campers of varying different developmental abilities and neurodivergencies. And sometimes they would come with aids, sometimes they wouldn't, sometimes we'd have information on them, sometimes we wouldn't. And for a long time, it was a little bit of, well, if they show up, and we're gonna work with them as best we can. And that's the counselor's job. They're just gonna have to deal with it. And we started to look at how much stress that was putting on the counselors. And again, how much uncertainty, how much of a difference and a disconnect there was between their expectation of how they were going to run their group and the realization of what was happening. And we started to build in an entire program for unique camper needs, that we do more of the work ahead of time and on the back end, so that when the camper actually shows up, they're coming in with far more support, and the counselor is being talked to about this camper in a very elaborate way, so that it's not reactive. And I think even just that small example of like seeing something happening over and over and over again, and realizing that there is a system change that needs to happen, was a great example of just like a small component. On an aside, we have a pretty involved support system and systems of supervision, or really systems of communication and care. And so each staff member has a one-on-one weekly. We do twice a summer evaluations. We do a midsummer and an end of summer, and Andy, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but we do a 360 evaluation too, so that they are giving us feedback, and they are participating in a discussion really that is very professional. And I think that's also a component that we add into it as well, is we really try to make the environment that they're working in feel professional, so that they're getting that added value out of it as well. And so it continues that program. Yeah.
I love hearing that, because you touched on something that where I wanted to go with some of this conversation, is because, we get from let's have them leave orientation and staff training feeling that they've made the best decision of their lives, and then how do we keep that feeling going? Like, what do we have to do so they never change their mind about that? So Liz and Andy, you talked a little bit about the communication supports you have, or the supervision that you have in place to constantly, or at least consistently, check in with staff and see how they're doing. That must start early, because you must be doing some very intentional training of your supervisory staff about the culture we have is all about check-ins, and if we're sensing resentment, or how do we identify resentment if we're supervising a staff member. So I know internally for us, we've tried to use sort of what I call the teachings of Michael Brandwein and supervision and all this stuff that we've adopted and massaged to make it work for us. But this super staff supervision, to once again get into Michael's world. But I'm just curious a little bit about, maybe we can jump on, Andy, just some thoughts about how do you set up your supervisory team to be able to support your counselors on the ground every day, so you can sort of mitigate the resentment, or have systems in place to identify if it's even cropping up.
Howie, Brene Brown is second in my heart, only to Michael Brandwein. And I think, like, when we tried to really start focusing more intentionally on being the best support we could be to our counselors, the place where we started was with our leadership team. And we're lucky too, we have a pretty big team. We have like 8 to 11 members on our leadership team, not including us, depending on the summer. And we make really clear to them that their number one job is supporting our counselors, to enable the counselors to do the best work that they can. And that's really hard, because there's a million other things you have to do as an assistant director on a daily basis. And so Liz and I spend a lot of our time, I think, talking to our leadership team to make sure that they're prioritizing supporting the counselors that they supervise. We set an expectation, and we've gotten like more and more explicit with this as the years have gone on because we care so much about it. But we set an expectation that all of our assistant directors, all of our supervisors are having like a one-on-one conversation with every single staff person every single day. And it might just be like a, hey, how's it going? But we also do a little bit of training about if the answer to how's it going is fine, but it's obviously not fine. Like you dive a little deeper into that. And I think that helps us, like you said, Howie, kind of be aware of some of that resentment or anxiety a little bit earlier. And, you know, it sounds like when we talk about this in February amongst ourselves, it sounds like so simple to be able to check in with all of your counselors every single day. But then, you know, it's not, it's hard. And we have to hold them accountable for having those conversations and having that connection throughout the summer to really build this culture of support for them. I think the other thing too is, this is not so much on the supervisory front, but we really thought too about how, you know, the job of a camp counselor is so hard, and we ask so much of our counselors in terms of like how they're working with our campers, that we need to make the environment in which they do that work as smooth and happy and simple as possible. And that goes back to, you know, my experience as a counselor where I had to spend a lot of time like trimming trees and washing ski boats. That takes away from people's ability to bring their best selves to the work that they're doing with the kids. And we think about that at Tumbleweed and things as little as like, you know, we have staff meetings throughout the summer where everybody comes back after the camp day is over and we have dinner and make our announcements and do all that jazz. And we used to have like the giant 12-foot long Subway sandwiches that are kind of gross for dinner. And we realized like, okay, let's spend another $100 on dinner and get something nicer to eat. It's all those little things that, you know, it's the flip side of the little pieces of resentment that add up, the little nice things that you do, and not just things that are nice, but things that really improve the environment in which the counselors are doing their work, make a huge difference in the long run.
Yeah, that's great advice, and I think that more and more, it's those little things in the absence of the kind of compensation that they can get elsewhere, and recognizing, like, I do believe they go a long way with intention and sincerity. I think it's typically received very well, and that word spreads, you know, because they talk to each other about their experiences at different camps, our staff, and it's nice to know that, you know, our own camps are held in high regard because we are as concerned about the staff experience as we are the camper experience, which at the end of the day we know is directly related to that, right? Treat your staff nice, campers typically will have an awesome experience. So I think it's all hand in hand. Liz, you had mentioned, and I wanted it before, you know, as we continue this conversation, you mentioned that, you know, one of the questions I think we have coming into this conversation is like, what should camp owners be doing to assess levels of resentment? And you made a comment earlier about, in your setting, like picking a part of your program day. Like I think you mentioned arrival and dismissal. Like, where is resentment here? Is your advice perhaps as simple as, owners, just look at these parts of your program, your day, and ask yourself that question, or ask people what they're feeling in a moment? Do I have that right? Or is that what you're thinking?
So that is definitely something that we do. We go, and you know, in November when you have time, or even now when you really need to do this, you go minute by minute, because it's, and this is something that we talk about, like, you know, it's those little moments of resentment. It's death by 1,000 paper cuts. If you are getting minute by minute and you only get to 10 o'clock and you have a list of 20 things that staff are annoyed about, imagine how they're going to feel at 3 o'clock. Like that is such a long day to have. And there's so many things that you can fix. So yes, you can go minute by minute and you can really go through that. I think a couple of things that are helpful, and we've done this in the past too. You can definitely do experience surveys for your staff. You can pull groups of staff or former staff to talk about their experience, just to simply get trends about what they look forward to, what they like, what meant the most to them, what they were disappointed about, and pull some suggestions from that. And I know we've we've talked about this as if it's going to be easy, and as I'm sure most people listening to this know and are getting again that feeling and that sense in their chest, is that listening to your camp counselors tell you that their experience is not what you hope it is really hard. And it's going to be okay. You're going to get through it. You're going to pull yourself up, and you're gonna solve the problems. But just knowing and going into it and knowing that you're going to feel threatened, you're gonna feel like you're being attacked, and you just got to be as objective as possible, and just know that it's not personal, and you can change this. You can do a better job with this.
I have one
a
piece to add with that too, is I think something that is really hard to do is when you have those folks that don't come back, finding out why. And a lot of times we're like, oh, that counselor's not going to come back this summer. Thank God I don't have to have that conversation. But you should have that conversation. Liz and I don't usually personally do that. We have one of our directors actually is really great. He's the one of our leadership team that's the most connected with the counselors. And I think we all probably have that one person. And he will always tell us, we'll be like, what a relief that person isn't coming back. And he'll say, oh yeah, I hung out with them last weekend and here's why. And even though we don't want them coming back, it's a good way to figure out what went wrong. If it was something that we could have improved in their experience that would have made them a better counselor, or if it was just like, yeah, it wasn't a good fit for them and we maybe shouldn't have hired them in the first place. I think that's an important assessment to do also.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think
sorry.
No, you go, ma'am.
I was just gonna say, one other thing I would say too, in this kind of just kind of thinking back on either the staff's experience or actually your own personal experience, something that I found to be very helpful, and that's been a hard shift for me, and I think it's a little bit of a generational thing. I think it's a little bit of a culture shift thing, is if you're thinking back and you're making comments on, like, well, when I was a counselor, everybody had to do blah, 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 or that's what it's like being a counselor. Those are the things that you need to change. It's and it's hard because for those of us that worked it almost became part of the story of well yeah, my bus route in the afternoon was 2 hours. Like that's like why are we trying to one up each other with the negative experiences? And so thinking about that feeling, and if those things still exist, those are some of those first things that you need to address.
Yeah, because Liz, I walked uphill to school there and back. So,
Exactly.
I love that. Well, one of my biggest takeaways from this conversation, and there are many, but I love the idea that you not only do the check-ins, you do the evaluations, but I love the idea of a 360 evaluation. So we always in those check-ins are, what can the leadership team do to support you? And what do you need? But setting up from the get-go in that staff training, in that communication feedback loop of, we're going to do an evaluation, but you're going to evaluate us, and really setting the stage for giving that feedback during the summer. Because it is the worst later on to hear the whys, or I didn't like this. Well, gosh, if I just could have fixed it in the moment. And we all ask that on the experience survey in August, September, October, right? But in that moment and setting up that feedback loop, as hard as it is, if they're new or, uncomfortable giving that to you, but setting that up, I love that idea of a 360. So that's something that I really want to explore and do a more intentional job of getting from my staff during the summer, not later.
And we set up a way to do that was confidential. So not anonymous, confidential, because we wanted to make sure if somebody brought something up that was like real serious and we had to deal with it, we could. But me and our camp director were the only folks that saw people's names attached to it. And then we just sort of aggregated the feedback for our leadership team to provide them that, the information from the staff that they needed. And it was helpful for them too to have it aggregated, so it wasn't like these 3 people said nasty things about you. It was a much more balanced, positives and areas to work on thing.
Yeah, and it does speak to, for the young people that come to work with us each summer, it's in some cases it's fundamentally shifting their mindset around evaluations, because the moment the supervisor talks to the counselor, they just feel it's one way and they don't have an opportunity to engage in a conversation. And we've tried to, over many, many years, look at this notion of performance review and evaluation and trying to use language that makes it much more conversational and two-way rather than that, because already many of our young people come in with a preconceived notion of what the boss looks like or looks for and what the relationship's like. And we have an opportunity, just because of the settings we're in, but also the cultures we create, to make it much more inviting to give and receive feedback. And those are things I know we've tried very hard to do over the years. And we've talked, Kelly, you and I, about doing a show on evaluation of camp staff and addressing the many different ways, and I know it's a topic for me personally that I've sort of championed in our settings over the years, and we talk about that, but it fundamentally speaks to, a source of resentment could be just the dynamic between the supervisor and the counselor. And if you can break that down early and create something different culturally, you've now maybe eliminated an area of resentment that could just grow naturally.
Yeah.
Well, and again, so much of it comes from this lack of clarity, or this mismatch of what is being experienced and what the counselor was expecting. So if the counselor is going the entire summer without knowing if what they're doing is the right thing to do, they're going to feel really resentful when they find out that you could have told them the second day of camp that the way that they're leading something is not the way that they do it there, or that, if you gave them just a couple of hints here and there that they could have been a better counselor. Like you're creating this, you're just creating more and more space for them to fill with anxiety. And instead of filling it with anxiety, we should be building bandwidth, because like Andy was saying, their job is so hard.
Absolutely. And, it's in a world where we are addressing anxiety so readily in our campers' lives and our counselor lives, if we can somehow manage that, really positively, I think that'll go a long way. Speaking of anxiety, I love these segues. You helped me so much, Liz. I want to thank you. I would like to pivot to helping you lessen your anxiety over camp scheduling. And we want to thank our sponsor, our second sponsor, Camptivities, our friend Ryan Rosen, who all of us on the episode know very well. But for me and Kelly, we're grateful to Camptivities for jumping on board. If you're interested at all in a better solution for scheduling camp activities, check out Camptivities. We've all done this. We do the quick Google search about a camp activity scheduler, and you come across Camptivities. It's an activity scheduler for camps by actual camp people, guaranteed. If you're interested in manual adjustments, rainy day scheduling, lots of customizable settings, and so many reports, it will make your head spin. We recommend you check out Camptivities and take a whirl at their demo and see if it really fits into your camp plan and your organization. I'm a big fan, a user for a number of years now, and they're always thinking of making the product better. So if you're looking for a way to get away from your desk and back out into camp, check in with the team at Camptivities. I know that they want to show you the next big thing in camp. Visit camptivities.com to set up a time to chat.
All right. Thank you, Howie. We are wrapping up this show. It's always so hard, Howie. I mean, I wish we had 2 hours, because we could just go into so many different avenues. But for trying to be timely here for our podcast audience. We are going to wrap up and finish with our inspiration. So we end each show with something that's inspiring us right now. It can be a book, article, podcast, documentary, leadership quote, a conversation with a family or camper or staff. So each of us hosts will take an opportunity to do that. And then we'll invite our guests if they would like to share something as well. So Howie, do you want to start us off or you want me to start us off today?
Yeah, I'll go. I'll go first. That's fine. I have a book for everybody. It's called Your Best Year Ever by Michael Hyatt. We're all familiar with the acronym SMART as it relates to goal setting. Michael has written a book that's very interesting. There is something called goal achievement science. Apparently people get PhDs for this in college and university. But he's added ER to SMART and talks about smarter goals. And I found it really interesting how many of us in even our camp settings, I would be surprised if there wasn't one moment in your camp career where you didn't put that acronym up on the board for your team. But this is an approach that talks a little bit more about the having goals that are exciting and goals that are relevant. That's the ER. So aside from specific, measurable, actionable, risky, and time sensitive, exciting and relevant are added to SMART to make it an even better. And his book talks about, maybe this is the year you pick one thing, and it could be personal, it could be to your camp, whatever it is. Check it out, Michael Hyatt, Your Best Year Ever. That's my inspiration.
All right. Awesome. Well, I love a good book, Howie. Not that I need more sitting next to my bed, but you know what? Add another one. Mine is also a book. So when I'm not listening to Brene Brown podcast or Glennon Doyle, I am listening to NPR a lot in the car. And the other day, yesterday, actually, they had an author on and her new book is called Influence is Your Superpower by Zoe Chance. And I was so intrigued in her discussion about influence and the way we've been taught to kind of suppress what we want and influencing others. And she had a great question in there talking about saying to someone, what will it take to blank? And it just resonates so much for me with staff. Like, what will it take for you to want to come back to camp this summer? Or what will it take for us to change this or make this experience different? So I haven't read it, but I did order it yesterday and I'm really excited to dive into it because it just sparked my curiosity. So that's Influence is Your Superpower by Zoe Chance. All right, Liz and Andy, do you have something that you'd like to share with us?
Just to bring it full circle, I probably under normal circumstances would have talked about some Brene Brown podcast that I heard, but she hasn't been doing podcasts for a little bit. And that actually is the thing that I think is so inspiring that I first thought of. There's so many public figures that you really feel like you look up to, and you don't know whether they really live into their values and have the integrity that they sort of represent outwardly. And I think the way that she has handled the past, I guess, week or two of her podcasting career has been really so representative of it. It reinforced for me the good decision that I made being such a big fan of hers. And if you're not familiar with this, just look on her Instagram and you can see the whole backstory of what she's been up to and why she made the decisions that she did. And I think if we all looked at that kind of decision-making framework of coming at things from a place of learning and growth and listening, and being unafraid to be brave in your decisions, then we'd all be probably better off right now.
Agreed. Awesome. Liz, what about you?
So I felt like I was going into this and I didn't have any, and now I'm like, oh, there's too many. So just two quick things. And one is, I'll have to have my daughter listen to the end of this. So there's a band called the Linda Lindas, and it's a group of 4 LA teens, and the youngest one is, I want to say she's only 10, and the older one just turned 17, and they're Latinx Asian girls, and they play punk rock. And my daughter's obsessed with them, but it's because they're such like, it's such an awesome role model for her to have. I don't know why I'm getting like emotional. But long story short, they have a couple of their own songs, and then they also really live into the punk rock just value and vibe of like questioning the patriarchy, which I'm down with. And so I highly recommend listening to the Linda Lindas. Yeah, Linda Lindas, bunch of teens rocking out, just like living their dream. So that's awesome. Another thing too that I just wanted to mention, and I think just like the experience is inspiring to me. I listen to a lot of podcasts, and so often I'm trying to find a podcast that is like really educational or meaningful or just like kind of heavy. And lately I've been listening to this podcast called The Pen Pals. It's with Daniel Van Kirk and Rory Scovel. I think that's the right last names. And they're comedians, and all they do is read lovely letters that people send to them, and they comment on it. And what's inspiring about it, or just like what's really lovely about the experience, is it's just joy. It's just funny. I laugh in the car a lot, and I recommend, whether it's that or finding a podcast that you like just for the purpose of having a good laugh.
Wow. I like that. And we all need to find any avenue for joy these days, for sure, given working through all this stuff. Great. Not to mention, people should be listening to this podcast on a regular basis, Kelly. Let's be honest. We're coming to that point in the show where we get to, of course, thank our guests, Andy and Liz. It's such a pleasure to meet you and get some insight on some of the great things that you're doing at Tumbleweed. We always share at the end of our show ways in which our listeners could get a hold of you. Perhaps they wanted to ask you a question that you sort of generated in their head about this topic. So, Liz, how can people get a hold of you after listening to this?
So you can definitely email me at liz@tumbleweedcamp.com. And I also manage our blog on the Tumbleweed website, which is at tumbleweedcamp.com/blog. And we try to make it a good mix of camp related things and then just really important topics that affect everyone, because we really view camp as just a microcosm of society.
Ain't that the truth? Andy, how do they get a hold of you?
I'm Andy at tumbleweedcamp.com. And I don't know when this is coming out. Is this going to be before the ACA National Conference? Well, you can cut that out then. Edit.
Well, listen, that's okay. You can still say it, because then people who were there will feel
If you were at the ACA National Conference, maybe we had a beer together one evening. And then that's a great way to connect too.
Absolutely.
And if they didn't, Andy, they're going to be jealous after this. I have a feeling.
100%. Kelly, how do people get a hold of you?
Kelly with a Y at hiddenpinesranch.com.
And for me, it's Howie at camprobinhood.ca. And I look forward to hearing from anybody who has some thoughts about upcoming episodes. Please don't forget that you can find all of our show notes at gocamp.pro/ownerspod. You can find the resources that we mentioned in this episode and lots of good stuff there from our show and other great Go Camp Pro podcasts that are out there. We hope you enjoyed this. Andy, Liz, thank you so much. Really super awesome to meet you. Kelly, again, it's always a pleasure. Thanks for listening, everyone. And we can't wait to share some more great conversation with other great guests on the Camp Owners Podcast.